Hi, everyone. My name is Raphael. Welcome to Illuminate the Human Side of the Enterprise with Analytics. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, ZL Tech CEO and co-founder, Con Leong.
So I'll be talking about the human side of analytics, especially with the data that we already use for information governance. By and large, there are two types of data across the enterprise, structured and unstructured. I think on the structured side, it's pretty much well established and mature. And how we manage structured is through making a copy, putting it into a data mart, data warehouse, or data lake. And you have the likes of many players like Informatica, Databricks, or Snowflake. On the unstructured side, it's quite a bit different, using different technologies and different processes. They do share one thing in common: for the high volume, for the high value data, such as legal hold, you do make a copy, business records, for example. But the large majority, I would say over 95% of it, is designated as low value. And so the high cost of maintaining, let's say, legal hold documents and so forth cannot be justified for the other 95%. However, there is a problem in that new regulations such as GDPR and the like are not easily addressable, because you do have to somehow control this part. And therein lies the problem. It's too expensive to manage that, but you can't afford to ignore it either. So there's a new methodology coming in where you say, I can actually manage this, but without making the copy, do it virtually, and manage it in place. These are different ways to describe the same thing. So now you can afford to address the other 95% for things like GDPR or CCPA or ESG. At the same time, though, you do need to address many of your governance obligations, such as, for example, e-discovery, compliance, records, and privacy here. At the moment, they're all addressed in silos. And that, by the way, the trend is to bring it all together, consolidate it, so that you have one unified policy rather than chase silos. Now, you might say, oh, why the sudden focus on unstructured? It's been pretty much the front and center of every significant event. If you just turn on the TV or open the newspaper, every event that you see there, you see the unstructured data being highlighted, such as textual data, mobile texts, emails, and the like. Now, these are the usual sources of data that you need to manage for governance reasons, starting with, of course, the biggest repository, which is typically your Office 365, your Teams, your Slack, your Zoom, and then followed by your file systems, your SharePoints, your faxes, even there are some, and social media definitely, and your ECMs and so forth. There is, however, one peculiarity amongst all of these sources of data, unstructured data, and it's the fact that all of them are human created, designed to be consumed by humans. So if we're somehow able to gather all of this, collate it, curate it, and analyze it, it then becomes the repository of organizational memory and intelligence. And it's already been validated the last 2 decades, because they've been front and center for these folks, the regulators, the lawyers, and top management. If you take a closer look at the more granular level, you already have to manage all of these sources of data for your internal employees. Just based on these sources of data, if you can collect, curate, and analyze it, there's a whole lot more you can infer for every single human player. You can measure the influence, what they know, do they have leadership qualities, how efficient are they, and do they get results? In fact, this has already been reflected by the CEO of Microsoft, who in a recent interview with Harvard Business Review said the following. I'll let you read that, but the highlight is he says he's always felt that the biggest or most strategic database in the company is the knowledge repository of all communications within the enterprise. The impact of this is quite significant and far-reaching. For example, we gathered some of the early use cases suggested by our customers, and these are some of the early use cases requested. They're highly impactful and affects the organization in all departments across the enterprise and across the entire organization hierarchy, from the rank and file to the CEO and the board of directors. It also answers many of the tough to answer questions. For example, who knows what, the influence of every executive. I'll go through some examples here. For example, an often requested insight is, who are our top performers? Who are our top producers? If you do it the normal way, it's pretty tortuous. You bring in a consultant. They have templates measuring performance for every function, for finance, for marketing, for sales, and so forth. And then you have to go through the tedious process of updating it and keeping it current. Instead, you can look at the data that already exists, which captures every activity inside the organization. And you can tease it out in a very, very simple fashion. For example, in one organization that had over 100,000 employees, one suggestion was, hey, if you redefine that from top performers to the go-to people, you actually can track that very easily. Because when people go to certain people, they leave tracks in the digital sand. And when they go back, they carry with them content, and you measure the frequency and the source of the request, and bingo, you have something like this. The top performers or the go-to people get highlighted like Christmas trees. By the same token, you can also do the same power graph to see who are in the center of communications, the big influencers. But by the same token, you can flip the chart around and look at the reverse side, meaning the people who are on the margins, who may be out of contact or excluded. And if you then match those people against social metrics, such as the gender, the ethnic origin, and so forth, you could have the answer to many of the tough metrics demanded by ESG, which I think every organization is sensitive to. ESG, of course, stands for environment, social, and governance. While environment measures the carbon footprint and the like, the S and G, the social and governance, is very much human oriented. And then, of course, it can answer other things such as this may be quite timely for the time of this great resignation. You could potentially use the same data analytics to see who might be in danger of leaving the organization. In fact, the analytics would be so insightful as to guess at who might be disengaged to the point of leaving even before they think of leaving. And that's usually the best time to sit them down and see how their needs are not being met by the organization and what can be done to remedy that. Also, you can use that for example, in the work from home paradigm, where the workforce is no longer within eyesight. You often wonder how the workforce dynamics of collaboration are working out. Where has it improved? Where has it not? How can it be helped? And for that, you need some insight, some visualization of, first of all, how they're doing. And for that, for example, you can map out or chart out the entire organization and have a moving dynamic to see how they're collaborating. And you can actually surf through and click on various organizations within SBUs, divisions, headquarters, or even down to individual little departments, or to the individual himself or herself. For example, if you want to find out more about a particular individual, you can, you can actually go down to a single individual and then find out from there, whom is he collaborating with? These are his top 25 collaborators. And what is he working on? If you, by a simple click, you can see his work product. And within the work product, you can zero in on a particular work document if you so wish. And if you want to prep such documents for further analytics, you can even parse it into its component speech parts, and then do preliminary analytics such as semantics and so forth, or sentiment analysis. All of this augurs quite a sea change in thinking about analytics. The point being, of course, that you have to address your governance obligations in e-discovery, in records management, in compliance, and in privacy. But at the same time, that investment is not wasted, because then you can now extract the insights from it. But analytics itself can be changed in its most fundamental form. For example, all of analytics today, and I'm talking here specifically about unstructured analytics, practically all of it today is a sandbox approach, where you set up a sandbox, and let's say you want to analyze red shells on the beach. You guess at which piles of sand contains red shells, you throw it in, and then when the sandbox is full, you do your analytics. That, unfortunately, is not the very best. The sandbox has certain limitations. It's a guessing game. You sample, you test, you repeat. And if you don't have enough red shells, you rinse and repeat. Basically, garbage in, garbage out. The second problem you have is most of your labor is spent scrubbing the data, which introduces long delays and is not as timely. For example, if you throw in, let's say, a few million emails for analysis, you can't just go to town and analyze it. You have to scrub it. For example, all those pesky legal disclaimers in the email body. You have to recognize it, exclude it, because if you analyze it, you're way off target. And lastly, there's the additional issue of, gosh, we need to actually have governance in our analytics. At the moment, It's kind of like the Wild West. Next time you walk by one of the analytics repositories, you might ask, did anyone scrub that for personal data, PII? Or has anyone provided oversight to make sure legal contracts are not in there? Or R&D documents? Or the CEO's documents? Right now it's the Wild West, and that of course cannot continue. Now, these are the fundamental architectural issues that you encounter with the sandbox approach. And yet everyone uses a sandbox. So the rejoinder you usually hear is, okay, we're using the sandbox. Does anyone have a better idea? And there could be a better approach. And that is, if you look at all the technologies that scale in the last decade, you might maybe able to say, let's forget the sandbox. Why don't we do the beach? Because if you're able to scour the beach, then suddenly you address all of the sampling errors and scrubbing issues and the governance problem, because it's all managed as one. And you can create virtual sandboxes on the fly. Not only that, you can also repurpose it and pick up from where you left off the last time. Of course, the results will be completely different. Instead of the guessing game as to which piles of sand contain how many red shells, if you scour the entire beach, you can locate every red shell and probably pile a sandbox 300 feet high with red shells. And then you can do your analysis based on the size of the red shells, the shade of red, whether you want seaweed attached to it. The quality and completeness of the data and the analytics is completely different. You can also have a divide and conquer method where you say, okay, I don't want to start with a beach. I want to start with, and this is an actual case where a large organization of 100,000 people wanted to solve a very important issue, which was patent litigation. Instead of doing the 100,000 people, we say, okay, why don't we focus on the people involved with the R&D center in the US, the product managers that convert that to product, and the European R&D center. Altogether, you're talking about 3,000 people versus the 100,000. Why not bring all of that data into the repository in the cloud, preferably? Manage all the data virtually with the governance functions, and then from here, feed into your litigation and your investigations and your analytics. This could be stood up within days. And then, of course, you can expand from there into all other types of data or regions around the world. In the end, we're kind of taking a page out of Hollywood. For those of you who've seen the Minority Report, we talk a lot about the digital transformation, but this unstructured data is a very essential part of it. And this is converging very quickly. We're not too far away from that Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report, where you can have all the data at your fingertips and you can manipulate and data wrangle it. Of course, you can also solve for e-discovery, all your governance obligations for your litigation, your compliance, your records, your privacy, and also have human analytics answered. That actually covers the thrust of this presentation. And Rafael, do you have any questions from the audience that I could answer?
Yes, thank you again for that presentation. We have a couple of questions. One of the ones that we've received, is there any specific organization size for which this analytics is most suitable?
Actually, it's good for pretty much everyone, depends on the need. And of course, from small to large, depends on the urgency of the need. For example, from the very largest customers, such as very large auto manufacturers around the world, to let's say the top 4 banks in the US, they have the very large data sets and they have need to understand, make sense of it. But we also have on the small side, smaller hedge funds who deal with large amounts of money and would like to know what's happening inside the enterprise. So it depends on the need, depends on the urgency, but it cuts across. And of course, for retail companies, they do want to know a lot about how their human workforce is functioning, because that impinges a lot on their performance, especially retention, especially the retail store personnel and so forth.
All right, another question just came in. How do you collaborate with analytics vendors?
That is actually a very good synergy there, because whether you have a favorite analytics supplier or partner, or you have in-house analytics departments, the thrust of this is to take the governance data, which is basically mountains of data, and data wrangle it, slice and dice it, and bring it to the first cull. That first cull will be extremely rich in what your target inquiry is all about. And then from that point, you can have the fine-tuning of analytics with your favorite vendor or with your favorite analytics tools. Let me give you a prototypical example. The armed forces of a certain country wanted to understand and size up the issue of something they don't want to talk about, the rate of suicides. We could potentially scour the entire beach of data from the active personnel and retired personnel, veterans, figure out a sentiment, meaning measuring for depression, and then measure that against the level from a year ago or 2 years ago to make sure that there is a certain delta, that the depression happened recently. And then take the, let's say, 50,000 data items and associated data and feed it to a repository for further analytics to distinguish between the merely depressed and the suicidal. That's a classic use case.
All right, another question. Who are your main competitors in this space?
The data wrangling of mountains of data, of unstructured data, is still very new, so we are unaware of anyone that does it at scale and also can handle the governance obligations. I believe there'll be plenty that will enter. And for example, I'm pretty sure that Microsoft is also headed for that. You saw the quote from the CEO of Microsoft. However, there is a huge difference. The Microsoft architecture and DNA is geared towards the individual PC, that's where they came from, and the departments or collection of individuals. It is not so pertinent to enterprise-wide data wrangling. So for example, let me give you an example. The M365 architecture is really geared towards the individual. So when you want to search your inbox, You actually address your particular index. So each particular employee will have his or her own index. That's fine for the individual, but not so good for the enterprise, because it's akin to having a phone directory for every building. And you can certainly look up every resident. But what you really need is a phone book for the entire city or nation. That's very hard to do if you have to do lookup directories in every building. So given that, we expect more competition, but at the moment, we haven't identified any as yet.
All right, another question. How do you see the data being channelized for building a better organization via upskilling and reskilling?
There, I think there could be a lot of synergy between internal analytics departments or very specific analytics consultants. Because the answer to the simple question, who knows what? We have the plumbing and the infrastructure to data wrangle mountains of data, yes. However, in order to identify and quantify the skill sets, especially as they increase and improve, you need the help of internal analytics to say, yeah, this is what I would define as an improvement, and then feed it to our site, where we can then give you the data by scouring the beach, if you will. This is very, very different from having each and every individual employee establish benchmarks and then help with the metrics. Quite often, the talent management, usually for the last 25 years, usually has died of its own weight, because it's just too much of a burden to update it. Here you piggyback off of existing data and use technology, not people or labor.
All right, and one last question. What about privacy requirements like GDPR and CCPA?
That's a very, very good and timely question, because quite often when HR departments may present this or top management may describe the system, it typically alarms the people sensitive on privacy. And I've seen that firsthand when we present on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe. But here is a paradox that we have to get our arms around. And the paradox is this: to enable privacy, you must have complete intrusion. It takes some processing here. You cannot provide privacy till you know what components are sensitive and private, which means you have to know about everything about the data. Actually, as a kind of a shorthand analogy, the most private information management system in the world is also the most intrusive. And I give you the CIA classified information system. You're only allowed to see what you're allowed to see.
All right, and one quick follow-up question from earlier. Do you see email and communications as the only source to understand human?
Oh no, there are lots of data sources that are produced from the human side. And I'll also give you a long-range prediction. For the next 5 years, you will see a convergence of all of the data management functions across the board for unstructured data. And I'm talking about merging e-discovery to compliance, to records management, to privacy, and so forth. In the meantime, the same thing is happening for structured data, and you have the likes of Snowflake making a wave and data lakes and the like. However, the next wave of convergence will start happening shortly, and will probably get there in about 10 years' time. And that is the merging of all the data, both structured and unstructured. That is deserving of another webinar by itself. We've already seen the tracks in the sand that leads to that destination. And we are one of the participants that are trying to get the two worlds of data merged and melded. And that would be the true essence of what Minority Report showed us.
All right, and one final related question before we end the session. Vizier's recent acquisition has started unstructured data conversation in HR. What non-HR insight can ZL Tech stand up quickest?
Actually, I mentioned it earlier, but this kind of paradigm can be applied to just about any function, any department at any level of the organization. For example, from the rank and file, you have all of the issues with regard to efficiency, collaboration, how to improve it, and so forth, all the way up to the top of the enterprise concerns at the board of director level, where they are very concerned about their ESG metrics. And then you have the CEO who's concerned about certain things such as crisis management, such as talent management, such as even post-merger integration. This is an active concern right now in one of our projects, where a CEO merges, he likes making acquisitions, but the trickiest part of the acquisition in terms of success is the post-merger integration. Typically, they get the feedback a bit late in the game, 18 months to 2 years later. And by then, when it's apparent that it's not going so well, Wall Street is howling for its blood. In this particular case, if you measure all of the activities, the collaboration, the post-merger integration activity, you can highlight the areas where you expect the activity to happen, and then every morning click a button and see a heat map of how the activity is occurring, so that you can attack the issue, if there is an issue, way before the 18-month mark or the 24-month mark. This is of vital interest to the CEO. This is just one example. So this kind of human insight is applicable to all departments, all functions, at all levels of the organization. And it affects not just the top line, sales, but also the bottom line, profits, and every line in between.
All right, I think that about does it. We have had a few questions that came in late, but we'll, again, make sure to get back to you directly. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out and email us at info@zlti.com. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great day.